So, welcome to Sangha Night, and we find ourselves in a series of talks which is called Thus Have I Heard. They're talks about the teachings of the Buddha. So the Buddha wandered around for nearly 50 years teaching the Dharma, teaching what he'd realised in his enlightenment, teaching what reality is. He wandered around northern India teaching whoever he met. So quite often he'd set up, stay in somewhere close to a big city, so that lots of local people could go, ask him questions, come and listen to his talks. And he talked to all sorts of different people. So he talked to musicians, to potters, to smiths, to farmers, kings, courtesans, a whole huge range of people. And I think he managed to express the Dharma normally in a way that people made sense to those people. And so I'm talking today about a couple of different groups of people he met who had very different attitudes to learning about the Dharma, to their practice. And then next week, Vidanya is going to be talking about how the Buddha talked with a potter and a king, the different conversations he had with the potter and the king. And it's interesting that many people, when they met the Buddha, there was something in the Buddha's, just being in the presence of the Buddha, that meant that he could just say a few simple words, and they would either decide then and there that they were going to go for refuge, as it's called, to the Buddha. They were going to dedicate their lives around his teaching, or many of them actually became enlightened on the spot as well. So there's something about the way he could express his experience to other people that had a very strong effect on them. Okay, so my talk is entitled Tales That Bind, Tales of Freedom. So I'm looking at the stories that we tell about our experiences. And some of those stories can lead us into a lot of difficulty and a lot of suffering. And some of them, the way that we look at our experience, can liberate us. The stories we tell can actually take us towards freedom. And how also, by becoming more consciously aware of stories that we tell ourselves, and then deciding to adopt helpful stories rather than unhelpful stories, we can actually start to go beyond those stories altogether. So we tell ourselves stories, we can become more conscious of them, and then we can go beyond those stories altogether. So I'm going to start with one time in the Buddha's life. And he was staying in a place where there were lots of different disparate groups of people who were interested in exploring sort of major philosophical ideas. So they were asking the big questions. There were recluses and Brahmins, wanderers of various sects who were living in this place. And it says in the text about them that they were various views, various beliefs, various opinions. And even more that actually they relied for their support on their various views. So at that time, it was a culture to support wandering people who were exploring reality, looking for teachings. Villagers and farmers would support people with food every day. And it's interesting that these people were actually relied for their support on their various views. So what were their various views? For instance, they were: everything ends with death. Only this is true, and every other view is false. Life continues after death. Only this is true, and any other view is false. The world is finite. Only this is true, and any other view is false. The world is infinite. Only this is true, and any other view is false. And so on. So people with lots of strong views. The text says they lived quarrelsome, disputatious and wrangling. I love that. I'm going to say it again because I love it. They lived quarrelsome, disputatious and wrangling, wounding each other with verbal darts. So I can really get a picture of a kind of like, a bit like the internet actually. A bit like the comments section. Quarrelsome, disputatious, wrangling, wounding each other with verbal darts. Yes. Anyway, so actually there's nothing wrong with asking all those questions. They're good questions. Is life finite? Is the world infinite, or does it end at some point? There are questions that scientists look at now. Do we live on in some way after death, or is death it? big questions that are very important to us as human beings living in this very confusing, this mysterious world that we find ourselves in. But what was happening was the bhikkhus were taking positions. They were taking positions on these matters, and then they were getting angry with each other about them. And there were things they couldn't know, actually, that they could only speculate on. They didn't know if life continued after death. They didn't know if the world was infinite or finite, but they'd taken views on it, and they were just going to see those views through, whatever. So somebody went to the Buddha, told him about what was going on, and the Buddha told them all a story. And he said, once upon a time there was a king. This king asked his servants to gather together in the palace all the people who'd been born blind in that city. So a servant went out and gathered up all the people who'd been born blind, took them to the palace. And the servant took in an elephant. I imagine in the courtyard, put this great big elephant right in the middle of the courtyard. And then the servant said to the first group of blind people, go up to the elephant and feel the head of the elephant. Then the second group went up and had a go at working out what the ear of an elephant felt like. Another group, the tusk, the trunk, the body, the foot. So basically different groups of people who couldn't see went up and tried to get a sense of what was going on there, some of them by touching different parts of the elephant. So after a while, the king came out and he said to the blind people, have you been shown the elephant? And they all said, oh, yes, we have. We've had a good explore of the elephant. And the king said to them, so tell me, what is an elephant like? So those who'd been shown the head of the elephant said an elephant is just like a water jar. So you can imagine like a big jar. The ear, those who've been shown the ear, said it's like a winnowing basket, which I think is like something you kind of go like this with when you've got wheat. They're all very, they're all very kind of agricultural ways that people see them, which is quite interesting. The foot of an elephant, they said, an elephant is like a post. Another group who told the tail, they said it's like a pestle. And then the group that had touched the tuft at the end of the tail, they said, no, an elephant is like a broom. So, and then each group heard the other, and they went, no, you're completely wrong. I know what an elephant's like. It's not like a pestle at all, it's a broom. It's not like a basket, it's a post. It's not a winnowing basket thing, it's actually, it's a water jar, so you can get a sense. And in fact, they got so angry with each other that they started fighting each other with their fists, sadly, much to the entertainment of the king. Anyway, so the Buddha said to everybody, this is what you're like, okay? You are fighting in this way with each other. You followers of all these various sects, you're like these blind people. You're unseeing. You can't see the whole of the truth. And you're identifying with just a little bit that you might have had some perception of. So what the Buddha means is we only actually are probably able to see part of the truth. We can easily become very literal. The little bit part of the truth that we can see, we think it's everything. And in fact, what we need to do, of course, is have humility. Have a sense that the world might be much more mysterious, much bigger than we can tell at the moment. That we can actually perhaps only have an idea of a very small part of the world through our senses. And we can be limited by the stories. We don't see the bigger, much more exciting picture. Because actually, a real whole of an elephant, how much more exciting is that than just a pole or a pestle or a winnowing basket? An elephant is a pretty amazing creature. And if we just see one little bit of it, we don't get a sense of reality. So that's the story of the vexatious bhikkhus. So the next story is very different. It's about somebody who's called Bahaya, who's known as Bahaya of the bark garments. And I kind of always imagine him living wearing kind of bits of bark like you'd get off a tree here, kind of wrapped around him. But I don't think that's true. I think it's more that they took fibres from the bark and then kind of wove it into garments. But anyway, so he's known as Bahaya of the bark garments. And he lived a long way from where the Buddha was. He lived right on the west coast of India, quite near to Mumbai. And he was a teacher, he was a practitioner, someone who was searching for the truth. And he was described as respected, revered, honoured, venerated, given homage. He was one who obtained the requisites of robes, alms, food, lodging, and medicines. So he was pretty well set up. He had followers. Things were going well for him. And I kind of imagine him, like, I've never been to Goa, but that's on the west coast near Mumbai. So I kind of imagine him living in this beautiful place by the sea. You know, life is pretty good for him. One day in meditation, he had some kind of big experience, and he thought, oh, gosh, maybe that's it. Maybe I am enlightened now. But a relative came to him, someone who'd been a relative of his, what's called a Devata, a god, came to him and said, no, you aren't. So Devata means God, and at the time of the Buddha, it would have been completely normal for people to think that there were gods in this room, that there were all sorts of beings and spirits living alongside us. So some of us, that's not our experience now. So we can think of when something like that happens in one of these stories, that perhaps it's a deeper part of the person, or a higher part of the person. It's part of their consciousness that they're not normally in touch with. So whoever it is, this Devata, whether a god or whether just a deeper part of the consciousness, said to Baha'ya, you're definitely not in any way enlightened, and in fact you're not even following a path that will lead you to enlightenment. What you're doing just isn't going to work for you. So Baha'ya asked, okay, is there anybody who is enlightened and who can teach me the path to be enlightened? And the Devata, the god, said yes, someone called the Buddha, the awakened one, and he's teaching the path to enlightenment. So Baha'ya thought, I'm going to go there straight away. In fact, it was about 1,000 miles that he had to travel to get there, and he walked every day, only resting at night. I don't know how long it takes to walk 1,000 miles, but quite a long time. So he walked. When he arrived where the Buddha was out on his alms round, so he was begging for his food. Quite interesting that the Buddha, the awakened one, didn't kind of ask people to go out and beg for food for him and just kind of eat all the best bits. He actually went out himself every day, you know, from house to house, getting his own food. Anyway, and the custom was that when the Buddha was doing this, was out on his alms round, you didn't ask him any questions. You didn't ask him for any teachings. You waited till he'd gone back home, had his food, and then he'd answer your questions. But Baha'ya was much more impatient than that. He saw the Buddha, and he described the Buddha as pleasing, lovely to see, with calmed senses and tranquil mind, attained to perfect poise and calm, a perfected one, watchful with restrained senses. So I think Baha'ya knew that this was the Buddha, this is the person he was going to ask. He fell at his feet and he said, please, could you teach me some Dharma, Lord? Could you teach me something? I don't know how long I'm going to live. I don't know how long you're going to live. Please, could you teach me something? And the Buddha said, no, could you just wait till I come back off my arms round? And then Baha'ya went, no, really, I really don't know how long I'm going to live. Please, could you teach me? And the Buddha was, well, it's normally done that, you know, you wait until I come back off my arms round. And then Baha'ya asked a third time, please, could you teach me some Dharma? And the Buddha had a custom that if someone did ask 3 times, he would respond. So he decided he would give Baha'ya a teaching. Okay, when he did. So, the teaching is, herein, Baha'ya, you should train yourself thus. In the seen will be merely what is seen. In the heard will be merely what is heard. In the sensed will be merely what is sensed. In the cognized will be merely what is cognized. In this way you should train yourself, Baha'ya. When Baha'ya for you in the seen is merely what is seen, in the cognized is merely what is cognized, then Baha'ya you will not be with that. When Baha'ya you are not with that, then Baha'ya you will not be in that. When Baha'ya you are not in that, then Baha'ya you will be neither here nor beyond, nor in between the two. Just this is the end of suffering. And then through this brief Dharma teaching, the mind of Baha'ya of the bark cloth was immediately freed from the taints without grasping. And the Buddha, having instructed him, went away. So how are you all doing? Anybody got it? Seen through it? Sean has, yay. Just watch out, Sean, though, because what happens to Bahaya next isn't very good. Watch out. Okay, so what does happen to Bahaya next, poor old Bahaya, is he actually gets killed by a cow. Somehow, I know, somehow it gets between a cow and her calf, and the cow gets very angry, and I don't know exactly what happens, but Bahaya dies in it, so he dies. And when the Buddha found out what had happened to Bahaya, he asked the other monks to give Bahaya the kind of burial that you would give to someone who'd been living as part of the monks' community for some time. So he saw him as being part of the community, even though they'd only just met. And the monk said, so what happened to Bahaya when he heard your teaching? And the Buddha said, yes, he did attain complete enlightenment from my teaching. He attained final nirvana. So what does it mean, that teaching? In the seen is only the seen. In the cognized is merely the cognized. In the sensed is only the sensed. So, what it's asking Bahaya to train in doing is seeing only what he's seeing, not adding anything to it. Hearing, thinking, perceiving, just simply experiencing what is actually happening for him at the moment. So no proliferation, no prapancha. Oh, okay. We'll come back to that bit in a bit. So prapancha, proliferation. So prapancha is a word that means what your mind does when it just goes off, when it proliferates. So it's when you kind of go, oh my God, there's loads of people looking at me and I don't know what I'm going to say. I'm never going to give a talk again. I have to leave the Buddhist Centre, leave Sheffield and go and live in Orkney or something like that.
Don't do it.
Proliferation is what happens when you sit down to meditate and you start thinking, oh no, I can't believe what I said to my colleague. I can't believe that I haven't finished that thing. I haven't sent that email. That means tomorrow I'll be told off. I'll lose my job. I'll lose my money. Everything's the end of the world. That's prapancha. Or
Then you're going to Orkney.
then you have to go live in Orkney with me. Which is great. It can also be the other way, can't it? It could be kind of like, oh, I just, I don't know, run really fast in that race. I'm going to be an amazing runner. I'm going to be a marathon runner, and I'm going to win loads of gold medals at the Olympics, and then everyone would love me forevermore. That's also prapancha. It's not always bad, you know. It can kind of lead you into all sorts of exciting places like Orkney, actually. So I've never been to Orkney, though. So that is proliferation, that is prapancha. It's such a human thing to do, but it causes such a lot of suffering. Because actually we tell ourselves stories, don't we, about what's going on and what might have happened in the past. And actually what is happening to us in the present moment might be something very different. So that's certainly what the Buddha's getting at when he's saying to Bahaya. So it's about seeing our present experience as it is. It's seeing it as empty of an inherent existence. It's seeing it as a process. So what we can think is we can fix on things. We can fix on things that are going on in our experience. And we can think that they have an inherent and fixed existence. They will continue like that. When actually they're just part of a process. So I think what was going on for Bahaya there is he saw that his experience was just part of a process, and that it would be changing all the time. And he was able to see that as well without the lenses that we normally have of greed, of our own greed, of wanting it to be different, of hatred where we want to push it away. Actually, greed is where we want more of it. We just want more of it. Hatred is where we push it away. Ignorance is where we just don't understand what's going on at all. And I think what was happening for Bahia in that moment was he had what's known as the mirror-like wisdom of the Buddha Akshobhya. So those of you who were here when we did a series before this have talked, we spent a little bit of time on Akshobhya, and you'll remember his mirror-like wisdom. It's the Buddha, he just sees things as they really are. He sees these processes. So what happened for Bahaya is he managed to train himself, what you could say is through pure awareness, through actually being aware of what was actually going on for him, through just seeing, through just hearing, through just thinking. So thinking goes on. It's not like he wasn't thinking, which is an idea I can have, that pure awareness would somehow be empty of thoughts, but he just thought his thoughts. He didn't then attach anything to them at all. I think he practiced for years, so he was ready. So when the Buddha said that, and he was so keen to see the Buddha, wasn't he? He'd walked maybe 3 or 4 months to get there, probably in quite a lot of hardship. He'd been so keen to see, and maybe he'd been so keen to see the Buddha that he'd interrupted him on his arms round. And I wonder if he even had to present some kind of an idea that he might be going to die as well, this urgency that he had. So he brought a lot with him, so that when the Buddha spoke to him, he was able to understand it. And I think also, I don't think I do understand it, so I'm kind of giving you my ideas of what I think it might be. I think also this bit where it says, well, you will not be with that, you will not be in that. You will be neither here nor beyond, nor in between the two. So it's about, you're not identifying yourself with anything, you're not fixed, your experience is just whatever is happening. And this is the end of suffering. Just this is the end of suffering. So we might get a taste of this at the end of a meditation. Quite often when we meditate here, we'll have just a minute or so of just sitting, we call it, at the end of the meditation. There's lots of reasons for that, but one is that we might experience after we've been doing our mindfulness of breathing or our metta, if we let go of the practice and just sit for a while, we might experience that feeling of just being in the moment, of just whatever is happening for us, we can just be there, the pure awareness of what's going on. On retreats, if we go on retreat, we might find that there are longer periods of just sitting in between meditations. So we might do a 40-minute just sitting after we've done mindfulness of breathing or metta bhavana. So longer just sitting, longer just experiencing that flow, that process going on within us. And it's why we sit on after a puja as well. My experience is that quite often after a puja, after the last mantras, those of people who've done a puja, after the last mantras have rung out, we just sit for as long as we can in silence, in a joint silence. And sometimes there I get a real sense of the beauty of just being in that moment. And interestingly, it's very warm. So I think there's something about pure awareness that might sound quite cold. It might sound like it's a kind of just observational, being outside of your experience, quite alienated. It can be quite perhaps an alienating experience. And it's the opposite is true. When the Buddha became enlightened, he saw with love, he saw with kindness, he saw with compassion. His was a warm experience, one of love. And so this experience of pure awareness, this experience of I can't, someone say his name, Bahaya, thank you, experienced, it was one of love, of warmth. It wasn't a cold, alienated experience. Okay. So it's emotional as well as cognitive. So Bahaya, or in those moments, we can be without ideas of how things should be, we can be with how they really are. So we've heard a tale of stories that bind. So that's all those argumentative bhikkhus getting hold of an idea, getting really heated about it. Those people who were born blind getting very heated about what an elephant was like. And then we've got someone, Bahaya, who's just being in what's happening. He's got no stories. This thing we can get a taste of. He's got a taste. His is a tale of freedom. He's free. He has what we might call perfect view. Perfect view. So he's got perfect view. So you might remember from the intermediate course or from Mitra study, those of you who've done that, that the first stage of the Noble Eightfold Path can be perfect view, perfect vision. It's when we get a sense, a taste of how things really are. But in that stage, I suppose between the two, between the bickering, quarrelling bhikkhus, the bickering bhikkhus, and between the Bahaya, there's a stage which we might call right view. So right view. Because until we're enlightened, we need to consciously perhaps decide to adopt right views. Because we all have views and stories all the time. Basically, we're in a world that's full of input. You know, both our senses, all our senses are getting a huge amount of input all the time. There's a lot of raw data coming into our sight, our sound, our minds all the time. And we need to organise and interpret that. So we have to tell stories about the world. We have to have views about the world in order to operate. And often these are unthought out attitudes, assumptions. We carry them in our mental processes without being aware of them. They're implicit views. They're not explicit. They're the ways we think the world are. Sometimes they're over-hasty generalizations from our experience. Somebody called Subhuti, who teaches a lot in Triratna, describes them as over-hasty generalizations. And what we need to do in our practice is bring all those views much more into our consciousness and take on much more helpful views. Until we've actually seen things directly as they are for ourselves, we're going to need to rely on right view for our practice of the Dharma. We need right views to direct us back to things as they actually are, so that it can help us to live in harmony with each other, with ourselves. The Buddha described the wrong views as being a thicket, a jungle, a tangle in which one can easily get lost. So another word for views could be stories. These stories in which we just make sense of this confusing world. I think to be a sentient being is to be a storyteller of some kind, interpreting the world. And as humans, we do this much more than other species. We tell ourselves stories about ourselves, about other people, about the world we live in, and about the nature of reality itself. So as I said, part of our practice is to try and see what those stories are, to understand them, because they'll be driving us whether we know it or not. So you could ask yourself, what kind of stories do you tell yourself about yourself? So your story might be that you're really shy, or it might be that you're really outgoing, or it might be that you might have a story that you've had a really good life, or that you've had a really difficult life. You might have a story that you're a very amazing person with loads of talents and abilities which just haven't been recognised by the world yet. Or you might have a story that you're a really bad person who should hide yourself away. Or you might be even told those two at the same time, which I seem to be able to sometimes. There's like both sides of a kind of aggrandizement, which is like, I'm amazing, and then the opposite, which is, oh no, I'm dreadful. You know, there's like two stories that somehow I seem to be able to hold at the same time. So whatever your stories are, and however contradictory and bizarre they are, they're going to be having an effect on you and your life and on other people. These stories are often unconscious. We don't even know that we're telling them to ourselves. So what we need to do is check out those stories and check whether the story has some connection with reality and that it's helpful to you. So ways to find out those stories. Well, certainly I think things like talking to friends is really important. Spending time in the Sangha, actually things like working in that cafe or working at the summer fair will give you a real sense of who you really are, not who you think who you are. I mean, I find I can do something like sit in Metta Bhavana, feel really loads of love, come out of Metta Bhavana, meet somebody and realise, actually, I'm really grumpy and irritable. So there's something about other people can reflect back who we really are to ourselves. If we are holding stories that aren't helpful to us, we need to let them go. There's no point in holding unhelpful stories. They might have been true once, and they might not be true now. We can do what we can to let them go. I think a useful story to have, which I think is true as well, is that I can change. That's a really useful one to hold. I can change. We'll also be telling ourselves stories about what makes us happy, what we need, what we absolutely need in life, what we couldn't live without, what's right, what's wrong, what's acceptable, and what's just not on, just isn't acceptable. Sometimes we will have deep, festering kind of stories about ourselves, and those are definitely ones to tell a friend if we can. Sometimes when we let go of those deep stories about ourselves, we can feel a lot lighter, a lot happier. So the stories about ourselves, and we could spend, probably months exploring those stories about ourselves. Then there's stories about other people. So people seem to behave, what seems to me, in all sorts of bizarre and weird ways, weird and wonderful ways. And I'm constantly surprised and bewildered by the way that other people behave, what they do. So I'm always making up theories, actually, about what other people do and why they do it, looking for clues. And it's a bit like I'm writing a detective story, where I look for all these different clues, trying to work out the motivations for what people are doing. And sometimes when I've come up with my theory and my story, I pass it on to other people, and then I listen to their story as well. And of course we need to be really careful about that. That can be very helpful, to be trying to explore and understand other people, but sometimes when you hear someone else's theory, it can sort of start to take on you no longer see it as a theory, you see it as a fact. And I think that's something we need to be, particularly in a Sangha, really careful about those stories we tell about each other and passing them on to other people. We'll have lots of stories about the world we live in. You might think of this as being a scary world or an amazing world. You might think your idea about the world might be we need to look out for ourselves because nobody else is going to do it. You need to put your family first. You might think, I can rely on the world. I can have faith in the universe. You might have all sorts of different stories about the world. You might think, oh gosh, I really need to have 10 grand a year and then I'll be happy. Or maybe you need 50 grand a year and then you'll be happy. Or maybe you need 100 grand a year and then you'll be happy. Or maybe you just think money's really distasteful and it's just not to be thought about. So whatever it is, there's some stories that you'll have there around money. You might think this is a great world that just rewards good, hard-working people and gives them happy, prosperous lives. Or you might think, no, this is a world where the rich are out to rob the poor. So many stories. I could just go on, but all these stories, all these views will be driving us and the way that we behave. And one sure way, I think, to have distorted ideas of what the world is about is to believe that the news that you read on the internet or watch on telly or read in the newspaper, that it is given a full and reliable picture of the world. You might remember talking about that in the intermediate group, where we look at how the news will give a certain distorted view of the world. Okay, so all these views, I'm not going to keep going on about them, but something to explore maybe in your groups. So what do? We're a bit like these bhikkhus in the first story. We've kind of speculated about the world, we've got a story about it, and we argue from that position. How do we move from that to be like Bahaya, to have a sense of the kind of, to see in the seen, only the seen, in the heard, only the heard? Well, as I've scrawled up there, I'm afraid, there's a classic Buddhist path, so the Noble Eightfold Path and ethics, meditation and wisdom that can give us a framework. The precepts, ethics, can give us such a useful framework because it can challenge our stories. So if we find ourselves thinking the world is a very mean place and I need to get what I can from every situation, well, we might think, okay, is that in line with my ethical principles that I would like to live by, of generosity, of non-grabbiness? So I think the ethics can give us a really good framework. They can give us perhaps a right view as we move towards having our perfect view. Meditation allows us to see our stories, to experience times without stories as well, actually. And how painful it can be when the stories come back, when the views come back. So I don't know if you've had an experience of being in a lovely state in meditation, really enjoying being in your experience, and then a thought comes into your head that gives you anxiety or anger, and you can feel it all starting up again, all that prapancha, that proliferation starting up again, and how painful that is. That's the views kind of getting into action, and it becomes really painful. So we can experience it in meditation as well. And by practicing ethics, by practicing meditation, both of these allow us to get a taste of this freedom, a glimpse of freedom, of being beyond stories. Yeah, so ethics, meditation, wisdom, the Noble Eightfold Path, that will help us all to move to a situation where we can see through our stories. But actually, I've talked about perhaps how stories can create our world. Somehow, underneath it, there is a reality, there is a truth, there is life going on in a way that we can't really put into words, that goes beyond concepts. Our lives are far more than these stories, actually. Reality itself is much more than these stories. So I'm going to finish by a poem by Sangha, the founder of this movement, that's called Life is King, which represents how reality itself is something much more than our stories. So life is king. Hour after hour, day after day, we try to grasp the ungraspable, pinpoint the unpredictable. Flowers wither when touched. Ice suddenly cracks beneath our feet. Vainly we try to track bird flight through the sky, trace dumb fish through deep water, try to anticipate the earned smile, the soft reward, even try to grasp our own lives. But life slips through our fingers like snow. Life cannot belong to us. We belong to life. Life is king.